Okay, so shalom kulam. Toda for joining us for the talk today. I'm very, very happy and excited to have Netta, who is, some of you know me, Shlicha like me, in Bnei Israel congregation in Rockville, Maryland. And she's going to talk with us today about the 6-Day War and, the history, what happened today, what happened after, and all that. I forgot to mention to those of you who don't know me, my name is Adi. I'm the community shlicha in Reading and Lancaster in Pennsylvania. That's what I'm doing. And also because, it's online and people from all over are joining us, I will be happy if you can share on the chat where are you from and how did you heard about that event, because it always makes me curious to know how people heard about the different events. And now I'm going to pass the torch to Netta. So Netta, go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much, Adi, and thank you everyone for who's joining here on Zoom or live on Facebook. So as Adi said, I'm the Shlicha I'm in Maryland. I'm in a specific synagogue called Bnei Israel. So as there's someone named Taibo here who is from my shul. So I'm a Shlicha in a specific synagogue. So it's different from Adi. I also want to just note, so it's called The Significance of the 6-Day War. And my background is I just finished my BA in Jewish history and contemporary Jewry. So therefore, I kind of have been studying this for the past 3 years. And that's why I'm passionate and love talking about anything that has to do with history. So with that, I also want to share a project that Adi and I are a part of called Life Online. That a bunch of community shlichim, we collaborate together. We also share our own sessions with a wider community. And if you're interested in seeing those sessions, I'm in charge of the weekly email. So I promise you it really is short and sweet. I'm going to put the information in the chat right now before I actually begin. In the meantime, I think I'm just going to share the screen and...
Oh, rega. Sorry, I mute you because I mute everyone.
Oh, okay, no problem. So as that, I'm going to share my screen right now. So we're seeing a pretty picture rather than that we're seeing the significance of the 6-Day War. I think the boxes are great, we will have time for questions. So because this is more of a lecture form type thing, so what I'll be doing is I'm talking about the significance of the 6-Day War. And I know that you had a session last week and this coming week about the idea of annexation and applying sovereignty for the Reading and Lancaster community. I'm not talking about that. And I will not be answering questions about that. I'm not an expert. What we'll be talking about is how the 6-Day War has led up to the point to the conversation we're talking about right now. So I'm talking about why the 6-Day War is so important and also the aftermath of what has led us up to this point. So it kind of gives you more of a background when we're dealing and talking about the subject of these issues. So I'm giving the background. I'm happy to answer the questions about the background, but I'm not going to talk about the political issues that we're facing right now with the idea of annexation or applying sovereignty, whatever term you prefer. Great. So now, after we've seen this beautiful photo, and I'll actually refer to this photo later on, I want to put us in the mood by seeing a short video because it is more of a lecture type, but that's why I pushed this video in, because I think it gives us put us in the right mind frame. So the computer sound should be on, but please do finger something if you don't hear. Okay.
The 6-Day War of 1967 was a pivotal event in the history of the Middle East. In the weeks leading up to the war, 4 Arab armies gathered near Israel's borders, openly threatening the annihilation of the Jewish state. Yet in only 6 days, Israel pushed these armies back and captured new territory that made it much less vulnerable to future attacks. After the war, Israel offered to trade much of this land for peace with the Arab countries, but they refused to negotiate peace with Israel. Many of the dilemmas that Israel faces today had their beginnings at this critical time. In this series of video posts over the next month, we will relive these dramatic events that took place 50 years ago today. In May of 1967, Israel stood in a precarious position. It was not the strong country that it is today. Only 19 years earlier, it had barely survived its war of independence. In that war, 5 Arab armies had simultaneously invaded in an effort to prevent the creation of a Jewish state. Yet the Israelis fought back and were able to reclaim sovereignty over their ancient homeland, establishing a nation-state for the Jewish people after 2,000 years of exile and periods of persecution. The War of Independence ended in 1949, but Arab rejection of Israel had produced continued terrorism from 3 borders. To Israel's north, from the Golan Heights, Syria shelled Jewish communities in the valley below on a regular basis. In the south and east, Arab terrorists from the Egyptian-controlled Gaza Strip and the Jordanian-controlled West Bank regularly infiltrated across the border, carrying out attacks against civilians and killing over 400 Israelis over the course of 19 years. At its narrowest point, Israel was only 9 miles wide and vulnerable to an attack from Jordan that could cut the country in half. Its supply of water was also under threat. Beginning in 1964, the Syrians had been trying to divert the flow of Israel's critical water source, the Jordan River. On May 11th, after a series of terrorist attacks, UN Secretary General Uthand stated that attacks on Israel were, quote, deplorable, insidious, contrary to the letter and spirit of the armistice agreements, and menaces to peace in the area. Israel had faced these threats since its birth. Long before the Six-Day War and before Israel had control of the West Bank, its Arab neighbors had rejected Israel's right to exist. To the Arab world, Israel's borders, the ceasefire lines of 1949, were simply the points where the war was paused to be resumed at any moment. That moment was approaching.
Okay, so I forgot to mention that this was a special project that was done for 50 years for the Six-Day War, which is why she said 50 years. It's 53 actually at the moment. But feel free to look and see the Six-Day War project on YouTube. They have great content to just summarize the war more or less. But I am going to take a step back using the video now that you saw footage and actual visuals and kind of are in that mindset to take a step back to this basically. One second. Why can't I don't know why I can't do this. One moment. Here we go. There we go. Okay, so this is what the situation was between after the War of Independence in 1949. But I want to just take a step back first and say that Israel was founded in 1948. This is the War of Independence. It's divided into 2. Part 1 happened in 1947 when the partition plan was first declared in the UN, and the war that was happening there was with Palestinian guerrilla. However, in 1948, when Ben-Gurion declared the state of Israel, that's when the 5 countries attacked Israel. And we have Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Transjordan at the time, because there were still, that's what it was called at the time. And you had Egypt as well. So those are the 5 countries. And this war was really significant. 1, because Israel lost 1% of its population, and 2, that they survived. That was a huge thing that they managed to survive. But as the video noted, they survived, and they actually gained 30% of what they were promised in 1947 in the partition plan of the UN. But as also the video was saying, the countries that were around them clearly declared that this armistice line, this ceasefire that they agreed upon, was temporary, that they were just waiting for the point to resume the war once again. And you had this Tel Aviv, Jaffa is 9 miles wide here. So it's really not that, it's a really easy drive you can do very quickly. So that's the situation we were dealing that was dealt with at the time. The next big war that's important to be aware of was 1956. It was the Sinai War. There was a whole story that Israel and France and Britain had some sort of discussion and agreement, and had to do with the Gulf of Suez and the Straits of Tiran. And Israel actually conquered Sinai. But the big result of this war, which is important to be aware of, is that one, Israel returned Sinai, and a UN forces were placed on the border between Israel and Egypt called the UNEF. So therefore, on the border between Israel and Egypt, there were forces that were protecting, that were observing the border, basically, to make sure that nothing was going to happen. So that was something for Israel to have them be sure that there's nothing happening on that border. At this time for Israel, their main enemy is Egypt. And it's important to be aware. And the language, the people who were leading the discussion in the Middle East against Israel and the next war with Israel was Egypt. They were the power in the area. But it's important to be aware that things were going on with Egypt at the time as well. They had troops that were sent to Yemen in 1962. They were fighting the war there and helping them. And so therefore, despite the fact that their language was talking about the next war, we need to be prepared, they weren't actually prepared. They had troops that were sent elsewhere, and their forces were in Yemen, and they were trying to build up their army, but they really weren't ready for a war during the time in the 60s. The other thing was that 1964, with Syria, they had an agreement, and they created this United Arab Command. And together, the idea was that they were operating with Syria against Israel, basically. So what actually happened in 1967 that changed the situation? So one was that Syria started attacking. Okay. Adi, if somebody in the chat is asking questions, or Adi, if you have any notes, just feel free to unmute and just say something, okay? Because I'm not going to look at the chat.
Okay, I just wanted to say that if you can let people know when it's time to ask questions, because we didn't mention that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought I mentioned. I wasn't sure. So basically, I'm going to be doing kind of a briefing of before the war, during the war, aftermath. So when I get to each part, so when I finish the part of before the war, which is pretty soon, I'll have time for questions. When I finish talking about the war, there'll be time for questions, and also at the end. So to kind of give a brief breathing between the parts of all the information. Wonderful. Okay, so 1967, what changed that time when you have this tension from the border from Egypt and from Syria? So their language outwards is we're waiting for the next period we're going to have a war with Israel. That this is not a border, it's temporary, and we're preparing for the next war, basically. So what happened in 1967 was that April, more or less, and also before that, during 1967, Syria was bombing settlements in the north of Israel. And this caused Egypt to be mad because they told Syria, we're not ready for a war yet. We have these troops in Yemen. We're not prepared for a war. What are you doing? And there was tension between them as well, but Syria was attacking Israel at the time. Now, the actual thing that really caused the Six-Day War to happen and kind of pushed it into motion was the fact that the Soviets told Anwar Sadat, who was he wasn't the leader of Egypt at the time, but he was in the Egyptian leadership at the time. They told him, oh, there are Israeli forces on the Syrian border, and they're planning to attack between the 16th to 22nd of May. They actually showed pictures and everything. They had evidence, but the truth is that it wasn't true. And there were no forces on the Israeli border. But this caused Egypt and Syria to start preparing for a war. So much so that Egypt, on the 22nd of May, they started moving their forces toward the border with Israel. And in addition, they removed, they actually told the UNEF, you need to go. So those forces that 1956, the UN put on the border, they were now told to leave. So this really caused stress with Israel, because now these two countries think that they're going to attack when in fact they weren't preparing for war. So they started getting nervous regarding that and referred to the US, because at the time, don't forget, this is a country that's 19 years old. So they have, yes, they have borders that are problematic, but they're also relying on bigger powers to assist and help and kind of support them at whatever the decision they do. So at the time, Lyndon Johnson was the president, and he came up with this idea called Regatta, that basically they would be sending this ship called Regatta, and what they would be doing is they would be that they would go through the Straits of Tiran, and if Egypt shot at them, then that would be war. But Israel shouldn't start something. That was their claim. And I forgot to mention that also around this same time as Egypt was moving forces and also removed the UNEF, they also closed the Straits of Tiran. So what does that mean? That basically this body of water that goes to the southern part of Israel is closed. That various trade and ships that would come to Israel now cannot come. And Israel declared that that's a use of force. The fact that they're so obviously doing things against Israel so that they are using force against Israel, and Israel can defend itself. But at the same time, they were waiting for that response from the US. Now, what happened is that the language that was heard from Syria and Egypt, and also the physical acts that were being done on the ground, were, we are preparing for war. And what happened is that the US was delaying and delaying and delaying. And at some point, Israel just said, what are we going to do? Are we going to wait to be attacked? And then, what are we going to do? We're going to completely be wiped out like they exactly want. So on the 6th of June at 7:30 a.m., they decide to begin the war. But what does that mean, to begin the war? They sent their Air Force. The first thing they did, they sent the Air Force to attack the Egyptian planes that were on the ground, on the tarmac. And I'll read the quote that the IAF commander, the Israeli Air Force commander, said to the pilots before they actually went. And I'll let you know what the result was of that. But this is what actually kind of determined the war. So his name is Moti Hod, and he said, the spirit of Israel's heroes accompany us to battle. From Joshua ben Nun, King David, the Maccabees, and the fighters of 1948-1956, we shall draw the strength and courage to strike the Egyptians who threaten our safety, our independence, and our future. Fly, soar at the enemy, destroy him, and scatter him throughout the desert, so that Israel may live secure in its land for generations. So I am now going to stop sharing and open for questions, but I will just note that Israel destroyed 75% of Egyptian Air Force. They were on the ground, they were on the tarmac, and they just shot from above and completely destroyed 75% of Egyptian's Air Force. And that basically determined the war right then and there. So people are shocked, 6 days, how is it so short and everything? I'll get into that. But that move and that ability really kind of was a game changer. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have regarding the prior to the war, what led up to the war. And if not, I'll continue.
I will ask if there are any thoughts or assumptions about what would happen if they were not, as you say, like destroyed 75% of the Egyptian Air Force. Like there are people who are saying if it won't happen, what could then happen?
Yeah, so there were two groups of people. So there was someone named Abba Evan. So he was very much pro waiting for the Americans because he was the ambassador and he was speaking to the Americans all the time. But people like Moshe Dayan And oh, sorry, Levi Eshkol, who was the prime minister at the time, he was very much for waiting because he was very nervous. People like Moshe Dayan and Moti Hod and I'm trying to think, I can't think of it right, the names right now, I apologize, but they were very much for attacking because they were very much army people, and they were concerned of what would happen if they waited. And the concern was that they were giving more time to the Arab countries to prepare and attack. They're giving more time for them to basically prepare for actual war and be able to attack, because obviously their abilities were much more than what Israel had.
Okay, Toda.
And if there's any other questions, feel free to unmute yourself, or if you think about it afterwards, then you can write it in the chat. I forgot to share the Life Online stuff, so that's what I did before. That I did right now. Is there anything? Okay, wonderful. If something comes up, then I'm happy to answer, or feel free to write in the chat, and we'll have one more opportunity for the chat as well. Okay. So, trying to remember. Oh, okay. I'm just going to actually stop share right now, and then I will get to the next slide soon. So the game changer, like I said, was in fact the I just wanted to say before I continue that I really recommend reading this book of Michael Oren's called 6 Days of War. I read it in preparation of a session I did on the 6-day war in June. And I, first of all, also want to say I really recommend always learning more and reading more opinions. I'm just one person talking about history, but obviously there's a lot of different opinions that's really worth looking into. So just wanted to say that disclaimer up front. Great. So as I said beforehand, the real game changer of the war was that first move that happened on the first day. And in addition, it's important to be aware that what the Egyptians were saying out loud was that they ruined 75% of Israel's air force. So they were completely disorganized, and everything was a mess, and people were nervous, and things were unclear. But the language that they were saying on the radio and to the other countries was that we are strong and we're the ones who are killing Israel. So much so that King Hussein, for example, was nervous to join the war, and he was being more and more convinced when he was talking to the Egyptian leadership, although if he had actually seen what was going on the ground, he would be very nervous and not have joined the war a few days later. So because of that situation, that the leadership was kind of in a disarray and they were disorganized and they weren't prepared for a war, Israel was able to conquer all of Sinai by the third day, by the morning of the third day. So considering how big Sinai is, it really was a huge accomplishment that they were able to conquer all of Sinai. And because of that, because they had accomplished already the main goal of the war, remember Egypt is their main enemy that at the time they were really concerned about, they were thinking about the other two fronts that they had. And that front was with Jordan, with the West Bank that was conquered under their jurisdiction, and with Syria, who was bombing Israeli settlements, as I said beforehand. So what happened was that on the third day, it was an afterthought. It wasn't something that they had planned in the beginning, but King Hussein joined the war. Because of the language that the Egyptian leadership was using, he decided that he is going to join the war as well. And what happened was that Israel decided they're going to attack or basically conquer and take control of the old city as well. So there's a lot of known quotes from Harabait V'Yedenu, that were said by the paratroopers commander. But this is a quote before they're actually going into the old city. And I really love this quote myself, so I'm going to share it with you guys. Okay, let's see if it works. Okay, for some reason it's not working. Give me 1 second. I will share the other way. Okay. Okay. So his name is Motagur. He's the paratroopers commander, and he says, "We occupy the heights overlooking the old city. In a little while we will enter it. The ancient city of Jerusalem, which for generations we have dreamt of and striven for, we will be the first to enter it. The Jewish nation is awaiting our victory. Israel awaits this historic hour. Be proud. Good luck. So I love this quote, and I think it really shares the thought and feeling that the soldiers themselves had as they were preparing to enter the old city, and they realized how meaningful and even mystical and religious this was as well. I mean, the fact is that I chose this picture because it's the most known one. This was not the objective of the war. It was an additional thing that they added afterwards. But if you say 6-day war, and if you remember Yom Yerushalayim, the Jerusalem day that's marked afterwards, this is what you think about. But in fact, it was something that they did because they could. And to be fair, by the third day, there were already discussions of a ceasefire. So they were very nervous, and they said, we have to accomplish this. We have to make sure we have the old city in our hands. So that's the accomplishment from that happened on the third day. And on the fifth day, when there was actually a ceasefire being discussed, people like Moshe Dayan, for example, who were very much these army people that were very wanted to have the upper hand and make sure that they're really fighting on every front possible. He said that we have the opportunity now. We have all of Sinai. We have all of the area of the West Bank. And how are we going to basically allow Syria to just not be fought against at all? They were the ones who were actually bombing settlements in early 1967. They were really hurting and causing civilians to be killed or wounded. How can we not fight against that or show that we're going to act against those who hurt us? So while they were discussing a ceasefire, and they already decided that 6 p.m. there's going to be a ceasefire, Israelis learned that basically bunkers or bases in the Golan Heights were abandoned by the Syrians. So they, in a few hours, conquered the Golan Heights as well. So again, another afterthought, but because they had accomplished everything that they wanted to so quickly and easily, they were able to bring their forces to these other places and really achieve goals that nobody had expected them to achieve. So that's basically the war, more or less. And this is the map that's the result of the war. I'm going to ask again if there are any questions, because I really just did a general layout because the aftermath is more in depth, I'll put it. And I didn't say this beforehand, but the aftermath I'm going to be talking about focuses on the land and the conflict as well. I'm just talking about the development from that. I see we have one raised hand. So Tybal, feel free to unmute yourself.
If it's okay, because a guest. And part, I think, because you keep putting up that very inspirational quotation about biblical heroic figures. But at least in American Judaism, the one that gets quoted often is Nachshon ben Aminadav. And I guess after reading that a few times, I just wondered, is Nachshon not someone who speaks to Israelis the way his example speaks to American Jews?
So the quotes that are here, basically, that I used were of commanders. So people like here, Moti Hod and Motagur, they're just very known, and they're very high up in their leadership. So I think that's why these quotes
No, I understood that, but if you go to that one quote, it says Joshua, David, the Maccabees. Mm-hmm. But for American Jews, at least what I'm used to, Nachshon ben Aminadav is more inspiring than I think David or Joshua or the Maccabees. So I just think
it's the people who were, I don't know. I guess actually, as somebody who was like the conquering of the land, and they were leaders as well, that makes these figures make
got
sense
it.
to me.
Okay, that makes
Yeah.
sense that it's a land thing more than a heroic thing.
Yes,
land
exactly.
and heroic.
Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure.
I think also, if I can add, I think also we have like, songs on King David and the Maccabees and Yeshua ben Nun. It's also a name that we hear more often. So I think this is also part of the thing. Netta, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is my feeling as Israeli, that we also know these characters more. If it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Are there more questions or in the chat or? Oh, okay. People who are saying where they're from, which is wonderful. Okay, great. So, okay. So this is from the 6-Day War book, and I think it perfectly shows the result of the war. So Israel grew 2.5 size. All of Sinai, Gaza as well, which was under Egyptian jurisdiction, the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, or the territories, whatever you want to call it, and here the Golan Heights. So I'm just going to share a quote from the book about what they accomplished. So it's 132 hours. That was the duration of the war, one of the shortest in recorded history. In that brief period, the Egyptians lost between 10,000 to 15,000 men. IDF fatality figures were placed at 800, in per capita terms of 80,000 Americans. 85% of Egypt's hardware, $2 billion worth, was destroyed. Israel had conquered 42,000 square miles and was now, 3.5 times its original size. The Jewish state now threatened Damascus, Cairo, and Amman. Its own capital was united. Israel had earned the solid respect of the United States. And I'll also note that as a student who studied international relations, one of the exceptions of use of force that is often given is the 6-Day War. Because Israel had so many signs that Egypt was actually going to be using force, that they'd removed the UN forces, that they had actually were bringing forces to the border, that had closed the Straits of Tiran, all those things point to the sign that they were going to be using force, and therefore that's the exception of use of force, one of them at least, in international relations. So really this example is become something known generally worldwide. So from this point, I'm going to, as I said, focus on land and the conflict, and the conflict has to do with land as well. So try to basically share why this war is so significant and why it's so important to actually kind of understand the historical background when you're having the discussion of what's happening today and what's going on. Okay, so first I'm going to start with Sinai. And remember that Egypt was their main enemy from the beginning of Israel's foundation, basically. So 1967, they have a ceasefire, an agreement, but the Yom Kippur War happened in 1973, and Israel kind of won, but they also kind of didn't because they weren't prepared for the war. And the Yom Kippur War that was mainly against Egypt really caused that discussion once again. And Anwar Sadat was the one who actually led the discussion. 1975 was the first discussion. And I want to show a very short clip, but a really important and major event that happened was that Anwar Sadat visited Israel in 1977. And just want to show his visit to the Knesset. He's the first Arab leader who came to Israel and also addressed its parliament, really showing that it recognizes Israel as a sovereignty. So I'm just going to show that. One moment.
While you're preparing that, I will just say that there is the movie The Angel, which talks about that. Which for me was very interesting to watch it, because it's really about the story about the Yom Kippur War. So just if you have time, just recommend it. It's on Netflix. It's called The Angel.
Thank you, Adi. I appreciate it. So I'm really showing just 20 seconds, but I want you to get a feel of what was happening and the excitement and everything. Hey, do you hear? Did I share my sound? Did you hear? Okay, good.
بسم الله. السيد رئيس الكنيست، تحتمل أي التواء عقوبة والأصباط، وما أوتي موسى وعيسى والنبيون من ربهم لا نفرق بين أحد منهم ونحن له مسلمون. صدق الله العظيم، والسلام عليكم.
Okay, so just completely packed, super historic. Everyone is there. Even if you don't understand Arabic, you can feel the excitement of people have, their headphones. It's translated live. It really was a big deal. And they did sign a peace agreement with Egypt in 1979. It was completely finalized in 1982 because Israel had a known settlement in Sinai called the Amit, which was removed. I'm sorry, I can't think of the word pinoi right now in English. And the thing was that Anwar Sadat paid with his life, and he was assassinated in 1981. So it's that's a result. And I'll just say that a lot of Israelis go to Sinai and hang out. So that's a result that you have today. So he was speaking in Arabic, and I don't understand what he was saying either. But the idea was that he was addressing the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and just to see that everyone was there and clapping hands and how meaningful it was. And you saw also the person with the eye patch, that's Moshe Dayan, who's often known. But so the point was just to get the feel and not understand what he was saying. So sorry if I didn't make that clear. Okay, so that's basically the situation we had on Sinai. And I mean, how significant is that from being the arch enemy of Israel, the follow-up that happened from the 6-Day War, from what happened from that moment, you had peace with Egypt. Okay, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. The next thing is from the, here, is the Golan Heights. So for a while there was military jurisdiction in this area, but in 1981, Israel voted to annex the Golan Heights, which basically means that all the Druze that lived there, that were part of Syria and that lived there, were able to get Israeli citizenship. Most of them were not interested. They were quite angry that Israel was annexing the Golan Heights. However, due to recent developments in 2010 of the civil war in Syria, there has been a huge rise in people who are actually interested in Israeli citizenship. So it's kind of interesting to see how in recent years you've actually seen a change and switch in the discussion about the Golan Heights. So internationally, it's now recognized as a part of Israel. There's a lot of dispute about it. A big thing is that Trump recently recognized the Golan Heights as part of Israel. But it's interesting to know that the people on the ground are in fact more interested in Israeli citizenship due to the situation that's in Syria. But that's a significant result that you've added Druze into Israel and the development of what we see up until today. And that it's officially, according to Israel, it's officially added and a part of Israel. The next important and unique thing is Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is united. It was immediately annexed after the war. So therefore, that's why there's this differentiation between Jerusalem, and it looks smaller than, for example, here. It looks smaller than here. So here we have a way bigger, West Bank, and East Jerusalem is included here as well. So compared to that, you have this, and it looks smaller because it is in fact smaller because immediately Israel annexed also East Jerusalem as well. However, it's important to know that there are two issues that still remain today. One is that there are 300,000 Palestinians in East Jerusalem who are residents and not citizens. So therefore, they get municipal benefits they receive. They're able to vote in Jerusalem elections, for example, and they receive benefits and healthcare and anything that has to do with their city. However, they can't vote in the general Israeli elections. So that's definitely an issue that needs to be resolved, needs to be addressed. And the other thing is the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is under the Waqf, which is basically Jordanian jurisdiction. And therefore, as Israelis or as Jews generally, you can go visit there as well when there's no COVID, and you won't be able to pray. And in fact, you will be stopped or scolded by policemen or arrested, depending how much you're provocative. And there are a lot of movements currently. There even were issues of escalation because people were going to go up to the Temple Mount. There are different movements. I have some friends who are part of Students for Temple Mount, which they often go up and I don't know if they're trying to be provocative, but they're definitely trying to make a statement of, Jews should be allowed to go to the Temple Mount. So those are two issues that need to be resolved regarding Jerusalem. But definitely the significant thing is that as a result of the Six-Day War, as I mentioned beforehand, there's this mystic and religious feeling toward the Six-Day War that it really moved us a step forward towards some Messiah and some, very big redemption, or towards that direction in that case. So at the end of the day, even though the Six-Day War, the focus was Egypt, it's become the focus, that the main thing that was achieved was Jerusalem. So that's the result that we have, the aftermath regarding Jerusalem. Gaza, it was under Israeli jurisdiction, and you had the places of Gush Katif that were there. But in 2005, a disengagement happened. And what happened is that Gush Katif was removed and Israeli settlements had to be removed. As a result, 3 wars happened, or operations, in 2008, 2012, and 2014. And now, recently, 15 years were marked from the disengagement. And it's interesting to see that from the left and the right as well, people are saying that it wasn't such a good idea. The disengagement, of course, I'm sure there are people who believe that it was a good idea, but given the result that Hamas took over, the humanitarian crisis, and the fact that the achievement was not actually achieved at the end of the day, has really kind of proven that. So I'm going to jump now to the issue of the conflict and focus specifically more on the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, territories, whatever you want to call, and I'll briefly kind of go through that. I see it's already 8:45, and I want to give time for questions at the end, so I'll be sure to be on time in that case.
Netta, I
Okay.
just wanna, if it's okay, just mention something about the Gaza Strip. I can, from my experience, I remember that my dad told me that before they removed the settlements, he used to work and have business with the people in Gaza, and I know he's not the only one. And after that act happened 15 years ago, things have changed. But I remember, like, he always told me stories that we used to work together and buy things and to have this whole relationship. So that was what it used to be.
So all the Gush Katif is really known because they had a lot of agriculture, and they had Palestinians who would work in agriculture with them, and that had to stop. And anyways, I'm not going to go into it, but it's definitely an interesting thing to look about. And my sister works in the Jerusalem Press Club, and they did a session with a panel, and I'm sure there's a lot of sessions about Gush Katif 15 years later. So if you're interested, I'm happy. Dia is happy as well to refer you to those panels. Okay. So focusing specifically on what everyone talks about right now, which, this area, West Bank, Judea, Samaria territory, whatever terminology you prefer. What was the most, the biggest deal? So again, because it was an afterthought, they didn't really think about or consider what would it mean to have control of this area. So the big surprise was that they had 950,000 Palestinians under their control, which they did not want to add to their population because that would give a majority to the Palestinians. And to keep it a Jewish state, that was a consideration. And they left this area under military jurisdiction. What happened was the 1987 was the first Intifada. And Rabin, who was in the leadership at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, he realized that we have to find a solution for peace with the Palestinians. This cannot be something that continues. And he began the process of the Oslo Accords. Oh, okay. Apologize about that. I forgot one quote. It's okay. So this is Oslo Accords Part 1. The idea was finally to create a Palestinian state. However, only Part 1 happened. In 1995, Yitzhak Rabin was murdered. So it's important to be aware that my mom remembers, for example, being able to go into Bethlehem, or Bethlehem, as I like to say. But we remain with the Oslo Accords Part 1, which was supposed to be a middle way kind of temporary situation. And the temporary situation has been the situation for the past almost 25 years in that case. So what is the situation? We have basically defined areas A, B, and C. Area A is all the gray, so Jericho, Hebron. Hebron is complicated, we won't get into that. Tulkarem, Nablus, Jenin, those are the main cities. And those are Area A, so it means it's Palestinian authority regarding security and also civilian. So therefore, all your medical and education and infrastructure of building roads and whatnot, Palestinian completely. And as an Israeli, a D&I cannot enter Palestinian territories. As an American, you guys can. And disclosure, I've been to Bethlehem and Ramallah before as part of tours, part of my job I used to do. And it's really interesting and important to learn. But I would never go there, just to hang out. I would never do that. So Area B is all the places in between. I think that's the lines. But basically, Area B is a lot of Palestinian villages, basically. So what does that mean? That police, security forces are Israeli in charge, and civilian, again, is the Palestinian. So that's a division. And Area C is full Israeli jurisdiction. So I mean, they're also in charge of the security and also in charge of schools, education, roads, etc. You have to have coordination because it looks a mess. It is a mess. So this is the map they're dealing with, and it's from 1993. So this was supposed to be a temporary map towards building a Palestinian state and coming to an agreement, but we're stuck with this temporary state. Is that it? I'm just gonna check it out with my next one. Oh, so I just wanted to compare of what we have today compared to after the 6-Day War. So what we saw in the beginning, the 1949 armistice lines, the way the ceasefire, the way Israel just started out, was very, it was without all of these territories. It was really just a border that was very vulnerable. And we ended up with, after the 6-Day War, all these territories. As a result of all these territories, we achieved 2 peace agreements. Jordan, we received a peace agreement during the 1980s. And also with Egypt as well, and with the Golan Heights and Gaza and the territories, we've had all these developments, but they clearly only began to be relevant and start the discussion in the 6-Day War. And it's so important to kind of understand the development since the 6-Day War, to kind of understand what's been offered, what's been the situation up until now. Why are we in this sticky situation that we are in right now? I want to say one more thing, is that that's the 1993, we're stuck with the 1993 Accords, but it's important to also be aware that in 2000, Ehud Barak offered 97% of the West Bank, Judea-Samaria territories to the Palestinians, and they said no, and the Second Intifada began afterwards. And it's important to be aware that people don't understand often Israelis and their, how Israelis are more right-wing leaning, or they don't understand why it's such a messy situation. And when you have the background, it kind of makes more sense. I mean, I think that there are a lot of opinions that are really, important to put on the table that regarding the next steps. And that's why you have the experts speaking about what should the next steps be. But it kind of gives you a real clear idea of what the 6-Day War did, or why it was so significant, and also why it caused a mess. There were these afterthoughts that you got afterwards that kind of brought us to the situation today, and also the developments that happened afterwards too, making the Six-Day War so significant, also so important in Israel's history, and especially for today as well, in the discussion that we're having right now, whether it's going to happen or not. You know, we got the United Arab Emirates to have, you know, to discuss, to have a normalization, and that's part of the discussion as well. But it's important to understand, you know, really this whole background, to really understand the significance of what that means today. So with that, I have finished my talking for a whole hour, my presentation. Thank you so much for staying and listening. And I'd be happy to answer any more questions that you might have. And I'll also put my email here as well if anybody has questions. Oh, okay, this is my email, and I see we already have one question. Okay, so I'll read it out. Perhaps someone already covered this, but how does the recent peace agreement with the UAE fit in compared to Israel's relations with other Arab countries since the Six-Day War, and especially as those relations relate or not to the Palestinian issue? So it's so unique because, you know, if you consider what the situation is with the Arab countries that are around Israel, it really is meaningful. I mean, yes, we do have a peace agreement with Jordan and Egypt, but as an Israeli, I don't feel comfortable, you know, going to Cairo. I'm not like, oh, let's go on a plane to Cairo right now. Let's bring my Egyptian friend over. No. I mean, people hang out in Sinai, and it's a really popular thing to do, but it's not a warm peace completely. And, you know, people in Jordan go to touristy places, but there is, I've had Jewish American friends who were in Jordan for various reasons, and they felt nervous, you know, being in actual towns or, you know, not in touristy areas, basically. So it's not a completely warm peace. And also it's important to be aware that, you know, Lebanon, for example, so Wayne is correct that the United Arab Emirates also does not have a border right with Israel. It's correct, but at the same time, you know, you have Iran and Iraq who are also not on, you know, good terms with Israel as well. I just wanted to say that Lebanon is because of, you know, Hezbollah, the whole discussion Israel has right now, if you hear IDF briefings, that we're preparing for the next big war with Hezbollah. That is the main threat that Israel has defined right now. And basically, you know, the way Israel faces or talks to, you know, Arab neighboring countries is more of how do we deal with the next threat rather than how do we normalize relations. So which is why it's so unique that this actually happened right now. So recently, especially this in this whole discussion of what is going on right now with agreement or not agreement.
I just want to add that, I mean, I know I and other people have the hope that that agreement will open the options for more agreements with different Arab countries, and that's really the hope, that like we're starting something. That something, I had a conversation about that, so I just wanted to add that to the talk.
No, it's really important, and I think it's an important hope to put out there as well, because I think a lot of people are saying it and feeling it as well. Are there any other questions about any of the content of before, of during, of after the war, of anything that's to do with also right now or leading up to right now? I'm happy to answer. I know that it was a lot of information in a short time, but I hope that you learned something and that it was meaningful as well. I'll leave a few seconds for you to unmute yourself and to ask any other questions.
I see there is more in the chat if you want to take a look.
Oh, okay. So Wayne was asking, I do not recall when United Arab Emirates began to exist. When was then, did they participate in any wars against Israel? So I don't know from when they've existed either. I would have to Google that. And they did not participate in any wars against Israel, but it's important to be aware that when you have the Middle East and you look at the map, you have a very clear Arab front, and they're very much in discussion and agreement with each other about what we think about Israel and what we think about the Palestinians, or who do we prefer. And there's a very clear, there's a very clear expression of the fact that the Arab Front do not recognize Israel, and not their sovereignty, not their existence, and would prefer that instead of Israel, there would be a Palestinian state. So that's just important to be aware, and therefore, normalization such as this, or even going back, 1977, when Anwar Sadat visited Israel, it's a huge deal. It's something that is undescribable and unfathomable to a lot of Israelis. So it really is a big deal for that reason, even if they haven't physically fought with Israel before. So thank you for the question. Okay. I'm glad that it was informative and meaningful. And let Adi say the final word before I go. And if there's any more questions that you think of afterwards, I put my email here as well.
כן, נטע, תודה רבה רבה רבה. It was very interesting and informative, and I think these are important things that we also should learn and know. And as you say, it's like, brief, and there's so much more to know and to understand. So I really, really appreciate that you took from your time and did that presentation for us. And I think that's it. I wish
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Everyone have Laila Tov. Good night. And we will see you in the next events.
Bye, everyone. Laila Tov. Thank you for coming.
תודה רבה.
בבקשה.
בבקשה.
Good to see you all.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you.